for many years, since probably 2006, but maybe earlier than that. SPLA was the only go-to licensing program for service providers. If service providers, hosting providers, cloud providers wanted to provide service or software services with Microsoft licenses, not Linux-based, Windows Server-based, SQL Server-based, and whatnot. And these days, there's more. And we've spoken about it on this channel many times in a more advanced way. The idea behind today's live stream is to try and give the basics. It's very hard, I must say, it's very hard for me to talk basics, and it's almost impossible to actually give a low-level information for somebody who has absolutely zero idea about software licensing and Microsoft licensing. So since this is a live stream, and I hope that you will be asking your questions, we could go either deep or more high level, depending on the questions asked, depending on what you're expecting from it today. My name is Alexander Golev. I'm the consulting lead and also a partner founder in the company called SAMexpert. We're a team of over 10 people now, scattered across the world, and this is what we do. We take care of Microsoft licensing, and a major part of our client base are service providers. So we've dealt with over 100 providers, closing in on 150 probably this year, and we provide all kinds of services. But it wouldn't be a big secret if I say the majority of the providers we engaged with came to us via the audit route. So they got an audit from Microsoft. They came to us to help us, to ask us to help them prepare for an audit or to pass an audit, to consult them through the entire audit process. And a lot of the material, a lot of the emphasis that I put in this training is based on frequently made mistakes. Most frequent mistakes and the misunderstandings, the questions that we get on a daily basis. So without further ado, I will remind you again that this is a live event, and the beauty of the live stream that you may ask your questions now live and I will respond to them live. You'll get your answer ASAP. If you're watching the recording will be published. If we have enough time, we'll put the chapters here in the play bar. But nevertheless, please ask your questions. And I want to ask it again. And let's go. Let's begin our live event, which I called Microsoft Licensing 101 for Service Providers. So for those of you who are not from the United States, 101 is basically a term that means entry level, as much as possible information, but entry level. We have about 1 hour of time, so well, let's go. And I will begin with a disclaimer that we're not Microsoft. We're not Microsoft partners. We don't sell licenses. We couldn't care less about Microsoft license sales. We are not affiliated with Microsoft. We're not sponsored, not incentivized to do this. And the only reason we do this is to help. Two reasons. One is to help you. The other one is to put our name out there. That's as simple as that. Always consult with the most recent Microsoft licensing documentation. And I will tell you exactly what resources to use, but even now, the resource you need to find to Google it is Service Provider User Rights Document. You need to always consult with it because changes are rare to spur these days, but they happen. And if Microsoft releases something new and you're watching this training after they released it, obviously this information will not be up to date. Again, the changes are not that drastic. There will probably be changes not to SPLA itself, but to other newer licensing programs, which I will also mention today and walk you through the basic, the foundation, the differences with SPLA, and what you have to deal with. All the Microsoft copyrights are respected as much as we can. We work against Microsoft, but we respect their business. So modern day licensing for providers in 2025 includes multiple ways of licensing Microsoft software for hosting and for internal use. And obviously, as I started with SPLA, SPLA is still the main licensing program for service providers. SPLA is a monthly pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-use, pay-as-you-consume licensing program where you are supposed to count all the licenses that your end clients consumed, and you consumed internally, by the way, in the environment that you dedicate for hosting. You calculate that amount of licenses and you pay through a licensing reseller to Microsoft for those licenses on a monthly basis. Next month starts, everything is reset, and then by the end of the month, you again count the licenses, and it's a monthly pay-as-you-consume program. Yes, it provides a lot of flexibility, but also if you compare it to other pay-as-you-go initiatives, which I will mention today, it's not a per hour pay-as-you-go program. So still, a client, even if they use something for a few minutes, well, they have to pay for the entire month. So that's SPLA, but it's not only SPLA. Not every product exists in SPLA, and I will have a specific slide where I will show you which products do exist in SPLA and what doesn't, especially the core Microsoft products. What do you do if a client has licenses? Or what do you do if a client wants to use Microsoft software on your hosting, which is not available through SPLA? So there are a few options, and the first one is bring your own license. Microsoft allows end clients, when they tick specific boxes, to bring their own licenses to either a dedicated or co-location infrastructure where hardware it belongs just to that client or rented out to just that one client, or on shared modern cloud platforms where all the virtual machines of different end clients run together at the same time. So that is called bring your own license. So they bring their licenses and run them on your estate. The other option, which is available since 2022, is CSP-Hosting, still largely misunderstood. CSP-Hosting is a wrapper, is an add-on to bring your own license. I will talk about the benefits. It's not really a licensing program. It's just a couple additional benefits for the providers to effectively utilize non-SPLA licenses in a more clever way, I would say. I would put it this way. We'll get to that. Azure Arc is not only a management platform for on-premises or hosted servers via Azure. Microsoft also, but only for SQL Server for now, allows end clients to connect hosted SQL Server only to be billed through Azure per hour. That is allowed on every provider. And when I say on every provider, that includes AWS and Google and other platforms, which sometimes have their own limitations on what they can use, what they cannot use. What we also see, and we consult some providers to switch to, is so-called self-hosting licensing options, which Microsoft designed for ISVs and SaaS, software as a services providers, when they host their own product. So if you have a SaaS application, a SaaS solution, say a financial solution, any other, AI solution, as long as the intellectual property for that solution belongs to you, and I'll walk you through more nitty-gritty detailed requirements, but the high level is, as long as it belongs to you, you may be eligible to buy CSP or enterprise agreement or traditional volume licenses instead of SPLA. It does provide cost benefits. Not massive, but just remembering this year's deal with a service provider where we help them to switch from SPLA to non-SPLA, and because they also used Azure to double use Windows Server Data Center licenses for their self-hosted solution and in Azure, which is perfectly permissible. It helped them save $500,000 a year. Moving on. And I included partner licenses here because we get lots of questions about, okay, can we use partner licenses in on our shared platform? Jumping a bit up front, no, you cannot, and we'll discuss it specifically on the specific slide dedicated to partner licenses. Hi, everyone. Well, say hello, where you're from, what you're here for, and we'll move on. Service provider license agreement. As I mentioned, the native licensing program designed by Microsoft for service providers and ISVs, and mostly ISVs and also SaaS companies, not infrastructure as a services companies, but IaaS, infrastructure as a service services, are also provided using SPLA. It's a native licensing, Microsoft native licensing for public cloud, for hosting, for shared access. It may be used on private cloud solutions. It's not a requirement because when you build a private client for a client, they can bring their licenses almost without limitations. But they may ask you also to, you know what, we want to build a private cloud, but we want to license it via SPLA. So by all means, you can use it. It's an option. SPLA may be used on premises, but you can't give licenses to the clients on premises to be used on premises. You have to give them a server or a number of servers that you continue to manage and only provide SPLA on their premises as a part of the service you provide. Only on that condition. You can't just give them licenses and say, it's fine, just use the SQL Server 4 core licenses for your SQL Server. It's not how it works. You're supposed to be the admin of the service. The documents that you need to study to go in depth on SPLA, there are two documents. One is service provider user rights, which I mentioned. It's a website which lists all the universal user rights and specific user rights per product, and SPLA itself, the agreement itself. We might, I will consider maybe doing another live event to talk you through the intricacies of the SPLA agreement, because some things that, to my surprise, still not publicly known, things like a 20 admin discount or disaster recovery rights or free of charge evaluations, which provide you cost saving benefits and you may not be using them. Read the SPLA agreement, read it carefully. It has those benefits that you may not even be aware of because, well, Microsoft doesn't do a good job explaining them. But also it contains terms and conditions around audits, around what you have to do, how you can use your channel partners, what sort of agreements you need to sign with your end clients. It's all very important. SPLA, unfortunately, has very limited product availability. So not every Microsoft product is available via SPLA. And the next slide will demonstrate that. And in SPLA, the licensee, that's the only program where the licensee, the entity that is licensed by Microsoft, is the service provider, not the end client. Speaking of limited product availability, so what's on the left on this slide? These are the only products. There's a couple more very weird solutions there that are available in SPLA. Please notice that products like Windows 11, Office 365, Microsoft 365, major parts of Dynamics 365, they're not available in SPLA. Some of these products may still be hosted. How? Well, we'll talk about it today, because you'll have clients, you probably already have clients that want to host also their VDIs, VDAs based on Windows 11. They want to use Office 365 applications hosted in your data center. You can't do it via SPLA, but you're still allowed to do it, and I'll explain to you how. So, but the SPLA product list covers the basics. And in the majority of cases, if I just remember what providers use across the board, it's obviously always Windows Server, always SQL Server, there's always some flavor of Office, and there are always remote desktop subscriber access licenses to Windows Server. So those are the core products in SPLA. Yes, there are hosted Exchange instances. Yes, there are instances of Visual Studio, but the majority revolves around just the basics, basic Microsoft infrastructure, basic Microsoft Office products. So how can you host stuff like Windows 11 or Microsoft 365 apps or any other licenses that you may or may not provide, but the customer may have? So the first option is bring your own license. Bring your own license are rights granted to end users to take their licenses to your estate, to a hosting provider. And because it's their licenses, not SPLA licenses, the governing document, the licensing usage rights are outlined not in SPLA, they are outlined in product terms. Those are volume licensing usage rights. As a provider, you may decide not to allow bring your own license. I did a poll recently on LinkedIn, and about 10% of the providers responded they don't allow bring your own license. Fine, it's your choice. It's absolutely your choice. And if you run a SaaS solution, why would you allow bringing your own license? Because it's a software as a services solution, then, well, it's naturally just, there won't be any bring your own license. The rights in the Microsoft product terms that grant bring your own license are flexible virtualization benefit, which is a newer right. It can apply to every provider, every instance, except for so-called listed providers. I'll explain. And an older right, which was called, it still exists, it's still called license mobility through software assurance with a more limited number of products. And it's the only way to take end user licenses to platforms like Amazon AWS. In the majority of cases, if we don't talk about AWS and Google now, all you need to know is how flexible virtualization benefit works. You don't need to learn license mobility through software assurance anymore in 2025. It makes zero sense. So that's bring your own license. What is a flexible virtualization benefit? Microsoft granted it in October 2022. When they, under the pressure of CSP, Cloud Infrastructure Service Providers of Europe, under the pressure of that organization, they improved and simplified bring your own license rights. They still didn't do what they were asked to allow every license to be deployed in the cloud, but at least they excluded, they removed product limitations, so every product can be taken to the cloud, but they still kept the requirement for the products to be either licensed with active software assurance or licensed via subscription. So you have to pay, not you, the end clients have to pay an ongoing fee, monthly fee, a yearly fee, whatever that subscription term is, to Microsoft to be eligible to take their licenses to a service provider. It's still simpler than license mobility through software assurance. It applies to CSP licenses, like CSP subscriptions only, because see, you have to have a subscription. And it works for every provider. Moreover, you may not be even a SPLA provider. You may be an outsourcing company. I mean, we don't provide services, but in theory, I can tomorrow buy a server, put it here under my desk, and start hosting my end clients in a shared infrastructure. It's perfectly eligible using their licenses. So you don't even need SPLA these days to become a hosting service provider. As long as you use end client licenses that are eligible for this benefit that's on the slide. Moving on. And as I said, it's very confusing when Microsoft calls it authorized outsources. Effectively, everyone except for the listed providers, which are on the left side of the slide, everyone is an authorized outsourcer. There's no authorization required. You don't have to be authorized by anyone. You are authorized by the fact that you're not Amazon. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's not complicated. Now we have this new offering, again, from 2022, which is called CSP-Hosting. So first of all, if you're not a tier 1 CSP, if you don't know what that even means, if you're not an existing SPLA provider, that doesn't apply to you. But large providers may decide to become a CSP hoster. And some of them became CSP hosters for absolutely zero reason, because all the benefits that you get. And by the way, there's a mistake on this slide. Please bear with me. I need to delete the third point here because it's incorrect. There are only two benefits, really. There are only two benefits. CSP hoster may build and pre-activate images for virtual machines with CSP hoster's keys. Licenses still belong to the end clients, not to the CSP hoster. Just a second, I think I'm not sharing it. I will add it now. Apparently, when I corrected the slide, it stopped sharing. Yeah, it's back. So you may pre-activate images with the keys that Microsoft gives to you as a CSP hoster. You still have to use end client licenses, or you may sell them licenses via the so-called license included option. You still sell them licenses. You don't really include licenses like in SPLA. It's not that you are licensed to provide them services. You include or bundle licenses with the services, with their virtual machines. And the second benefit for end clients is that when they use that license included option, not bring your own license, Windows Server calls for Windows Server licenses they bring aren't required. By the way, I didn't mention, Windows Server never had license mobility through software assurance. Now Windows Server licenses may be brought to a service provider, and we'll talk about it. And by the way, if you want to learn more about it, which I probably won't be able to cover in this video, please go to our YouTube channel, watch previous live events where I explain exactly how it works. Licensing document for the licenses that are even included by the CSP hoster are still, the licensing rules are still governed by Microsoft Product Service, because again, they are end user licenses. So it's not a replacement for SPLA, it's a completely different paradigm. Next one. Let's talk about, sorry, let me explain again the types of services that CSP hoster can provide. The so-called BYOL services do not differ at all from just any provider that decides to open BYOL. It's the same. The rights are exactly the same. There are no Windows Server cloud benefits. It's just bring your own license. That's it. It's just bring your own license. However, it's called in the very misleading program guide for CSP hosting. License included basically works like this. You pre-build solutions and you sell licenses together with your solutions to the end clients. So you're effectively hosting, at the end, you're effectively still hosting their licenses just by bundling them with your services. So they are the licensee. I know it's mind-bending, but this is how it was designed. So licenses aren't actually included, they're sold, they're bundled. The next option, which I mentioned, and let's talk about it a little bit more, is Azure Arc. Right now, disregard the provider business. Let's talk about Azure Arc in general. Right now, there are two products that may be managed by Azure Arc, but also paid on an hourly basis via Azure by the end clients. And the products are Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft Windows Server. Windows Server is still not permitted to be brought via Azure Arc, via the Azure Arc route to a service provider estate. Probably because Microsoft promised to release Azure Local for hosters, which is still delayed and probably will never be released. So look out for it. October this year, one of the bets I want to, I don't bet, but it's like a virtual bet. One of the bets I want to make is Microsoft may announce availability of Windows Server with Azure Arc on service providers, or next April, so these 2 dates. And at the moment, this is only allowed with end client Azure subscriptions. Now, unfortunately, I can't disclose it because it's semi-rumor, semi-NDA, but there are hints in the latest announcement from CSP that potentially Microsoft may allow, they're considering this, service providers to provide SQL Server and pay for it through the Azure Arc of the service provider, through the Azure subscription of the service provider. At the moment, it's not allowed. So again, it's not a replacement for SPLA. It's just another bring your own license program. And if a client approaches you and says, we've heard about it, can we use it on your estate? And if you help them to set it up, just know that it's perfectly eligible, it's allowed, and you can help them to do it. What are the benefits? Most of the providers these days that we work with, except for massive multinational infrastructures and service providers, are also active CSP resellers. That is your chance to sell them Azure services hosted in your infrastructure. Think about the benefits. I'm not advocating, I'm just saying that's what you can do. Again, just to remind you, we're absolutely independent and we don't advocate for Microsoft here at all. So using volume licenses for hosting, remember I told you about self-hosting. So by default, please remember that you may not, you're not allowed to use volume licenses. So for example, your enterprise agreement or your open value or your CSP licenses for hosting, you're not allowed to do so. And then remember that there's an exception. And there's an exception for SaaS-like services. So self-hosting is defined in product terms because it's related to volume licenses. To use that, your solution must be the primary thing that your end users access. So it's not a dashboard running on Windows. It's not some sort of like an Office add-on for Office. First of all, Office is not eligible for self-hosting. It must be an application which you didn't even license from a third party. It was developed it was either developed in-house or you acquired full intellectual rights, including all the intellectual rights. It's your solution. You own the IP. And for example, a financial application for schools or some sort of an ERP or something else like that. And your solution is the primary thing that they use. And when I say primary, the only thing they use, the only thing they access. So Windows Server and SQL Server, which are eligible products, are there at the back end, just to make sure that your application can run. So they're just a platform. They don't access Windows Server directly or via remote desktop. They don't access SQL Server directly. They interact with your application. Plus, as I already mentioned, the products that you use for self-hosting must be eligible for self-hosting. So not every product is eligible, but Windows Server and SQL Server are eligible. Stuff like SharePoint, for example, are explicitly not eligible. Office, not eligible. You can't use it in a self-hosted solution. And so, by the way, based on this, you may conclude that it's mostly for web application hosting or some sort of mobile application hosting. And the licenses that you use for self-hosting must be covered with an active software assurance subscription or be on a subscription. And CSP licenses, I made a mistake 3 years ago when I explained it for the first time. I said CSP licenses aren't eligible. The so-called CSP subscription licenses for Azure, Windows Server, and SQL Server are eligible for self-hosting as well. If you are a provider that hosts SaaS in your own data centers or on a co-location somewhere else in somebody else's data center, but the hardware is still exclusive to you, compare that with SPLA and see whether it's going to be cheaper. In all the cases when we did that comparison, there was a saving, pretty substantial saving. So there you go. And Microsoft partner licenses. It happens in every second audit we help pass. providers are usually, obviously, most providers are Microsoft partners. You can't be a SPLA provider not being a Microsoft partner. It's just not possible. To sign the SPLA, you have to be a partner. Everybody gets Microsoft partner licenses. And we see cases when they run, as I said, every single audit, there's either a question or a situation which is related to running Microsoft partner licenses in a shared infrastructure. So please remember this, it's not allowed. If you want to use Microsoft partner licenses that have different names like internal use rights, not for resale, partner pack licenses, MPC, what are they called, MPC pack, they may only run on hardware that is dedicated to your own use. So on your hardware, that's the only place where they belong. So please don't make that mistake. Please don't deploy them on shared service. So we've passed the 30-minute mark, and maybe we'll dive deeper now into basics of licensing. So this will be more basic for those of you who are just trying to get your head around Microsoft licensing, and especially Microsoft licensing for service providers. So products in the Microsoft world are majorly, with a few exceptions, licensed either on a processor and core basis, which I'll cover a bit later, and other products are licensed on a per user, per device basis, client device, client, or a client user. So in SPLA, products that are licensed per user and server products that require client access licenses are licensed with SALs, subscriber access licenses. In the volume licensing world, I hope you're familiar with it because that'll be easier for you to understand. They're called CALs. So what is called CALs in volume licensing is called SALs in SPLA licensing. If there's a server product, before you read the actual small print and licensing rights, please always assume that client access is required, that client access is licensable, and then look for exceptions. This is how logic around client access works with Microsoft licenses in any case, SPLA and non-SPLA. So always assume that it's licensable and then look for exceptions. And well, there are exceptions, and then we'll talk about it. When a user is licensed with a CAL or a SAL in SPLA, a licensed user may use any device and access any number of servers. So one user requires one SAL, and I'll make that comment here. Or the persons require licenses. If a person has multiple accounts, they only require one SAL. If a person, if it's not a person but a technical record, for example, a robot or just a technical record, technical account, they don't require SALs. So persons require. If a person requires one SAL for one server product they access, or one server functionality, that's it. Doesn't matter how many servers they access, doesn't matter how many accounts they have. In some cases, and it's rare, and in our 100+ cases, we've only seen one solution where device SALs made more sense. Actually, if you look at the price list, and if a product doesn't say specifically user SAL, it just says SAL, it means it may be counted either per device or per user. It's a very interesting feature of SPLA. The client used thin clients. The number of those thin clients was known, controllable, so they could prove with certainty that they only required that exact number of licenses per device. They had more users. The users used those thin clients in shifts. So it's a reasonable solution. The problem with device SALs is that, as with device CALs as well, is that with the proliferation of handheld devices, which happened over 10 years ago, Microsoft didn't come up with a good idea how to count all the devices. And you still have to license each device. So if I have a laptop and a phone and an iPad and a secondary phone and another laptop and a desktop, if I go with device CALs, I have to license each my device. So it's easier for me to take one user license and use any devices I want. Rights to use lower version. We often get, quite often receive this question. For example, can we run SQL Server 2000 in SPLA? Yes, you can. You still pay for the latest You still have to license the latest version in SPLA, but you may run any previous version. It usually doesn't create problems. What creates problems is misunderstanding of the lower edition concept. Some products, like SQL Server, allow you to use a SQL Server Enterprise license and in place of it, run a SQL Server standard instance. Why would you do so would elude me, because you would be effectively paying 4 times more than for a SQL Server standard license, but you may do so. Where it gets a lot of providers is where they report Office Professional Plus, but deploy Office Standard. In the case of an audit, you may still discuss it with Microsoft and get a concession. You have to negotiate it. You have to explain yourselves. But by default, when you get an audit report from an auditor, they will completely disregard your payments for Office Professional Plus, and they will note that you haven't paid for Office Standard. So please make sure that you understand which products allow you using the previous edition, lower edition, in place of a higher edition, and which don't. So please make sure you look after that. And assume this right is not granted, because only a few products have such right. So if downgrades, version downgrades are allowed for every product, in SPLA, edition downgrades are only allowed to specific products, and that's all. You can find it all in SPLA. License dependencies. Please don't forget, don't make this mistake. If a client is paying for Office Professional Plus subscriber access licenses, for example, don't forget that because they're using remote desktop services to access that Office, they also need, all these users require RDS SALs. Remote desktop services SALs are required. What you also need, let me rephrase this. I often say, if you want to learn SPLA licensing, you need to forget volume licensing. Because licensing models are different, formulas are different, there are similarities, but there are things that may get you. So for example, in SPLA, with SPLA licenses, Windows Server basic CALs or basic CALs, they just don't exist, basic SALs. So there's no such thing as a Windows Server SAL. There is a Windows Server RDS SAL that's always required when you're providing remote desktop access to end clients. But Windows Server SALs don't exist. When it's a non-SPLA license, in our case, bring your own license. So the client brought the Windows Server license. It gets complicated because if in the case of a CSP hoster providing a virtual machine and selling a Windows Server license together with that virtual machine, CALs are not required. But on all the other bring your own license cases, CALs are required. There's a difference between how the minimum number of licenses is calculated per server, because in SPLA, the famous, everybody already knows it, the famous limit of minimum 16 licenses per server, it doesn't exist. The only minimum there is 8 licenses per physical processor. The number of virtual machines on the Windows Server standard license is also different for Windows Server. In volume licensing, if you license the server with Windows Server standard, all the cores, you have a right to run 2 virtual machines. You want more, license it again. You want more, license it again. The increments are always in two virtual machines. In SPLA, it's only 1. The price is corrected, so it's not the same price. So price-wise, it's fair. But each time you want to deploy a new virtual machine, you have to relicense the server again when we talk about Windows Server standard licenses. So please pay attention to that. We often see that mistake that providers still assume that Windows Server standard licenses grant 2 VMs. No, just 1. Just 1. So always check yourselves. Always verify your knowledge, and jokingly forget volume licensing at all. System Center has the same limitations. For the purpose of saving time, you can always take a screenshot of this slide, and let's move on. Let's talk about SQL Server licensing per core and bespoke as well. It's a rare product, but we still find it. So in this case, with the SQL Server, when you license them per core, the basic SPLA and no SPLA rules are mostly similar. So the same minimums apply. Well, if we have time today, I'll walk you through SQL Server licensing, if we can make it in the next 20 minutes. No CALs or SALs or external connectors required when you license them per core. However, unlimited virtualization rights with SQL failover and SQL failover rules are slightly different. We'll talk about it. When you license SQL Dynamics Exchange and SharePoint per user, and for SQL it's a choice, and for products like Exchange it's just the only licensing model. The main difference with traditional licensing that you may know is that there are no server licenses. So for SQL Server, for example, it's a choice. You either license it per core or you license it per user. So there are no instance, there are no server licenses. Hope it makes sense. Moving on. Client management licenses. Let's talk about Office Project and Visio. So in non-SPLA products, and it also applies to licenses brought to your estate, previous licenses, not Microsoft 365, those old Office Professional, Office Standard, Visio project licenses that were used ages ago. Now they're called LTSC. They must still have software assurance or a subscription. They are still licensed only per client device, which is a nightmare. I would advise you against those solutions if you can avoid them. In SPLA, however, products are licensed with so-called SALs with desktop applications. In the majority of cases, there will be per user. Remember, I just gave you an example of me using multiple devices and this nightmare of counting how many actual devices there are. So the majority of cases, you would be reporting as a provider SALs for desktop applications per client's authorized user. So these metrics are fundamentally different, and just please don't make any mistakes, especially when you deal with bring your own license. But if you deal with purely SPLA, it's easy as that. So the thing which I need to mention here, which for some reason, unfortunately, I didn't include slide 4. User SALs are based on so-called authorized users, which means it doesn't matter whether a user is actively using a product. If a user is a member of a security group that allows them to access a product, you must pay for that user. So to avoid cases when you have 1,000 users authorized to use a product, but only 100 users require it, make sure that your security groups are tightened, that only those users that actually require access to an application or a server are in those security groups, and everybody else is outside of them. Don't allow all domain users, as happens, to access an RDS terminal server, unless it's the design, unless every user actually needs access to a terminal server. Moving on, I promised you a little bit in depth on the products, so let's talk about Windows Server. So in regards to, because you will be hosting different versions, unless you build those virtual machines and they're all fresh and new in the Server 2025, you'll probably encounter still instances even of out of support operating systems like Windows Server 2008. So this diagram, again, take a screenshot. This diagram shows you under which license, for example, you may run an instance of Windows Server Enterprise. The cheapest in this diagram is a Windows Server Standard license, current SPLA Windows Server Standard license. Downgrades are allowed almost in every licensing program. Down additions are per this diagram, so let's move on. Licensing models in SPLA. Standard and data center editions, which will be 99% of your instances, if not 99.9% of the instances you're going to host, are licensed per core and nothing else. There are no basic SaaS. So just to deploy Windows Server, you only need to license Windows Server per core at the hardware level, not per virtual machine. With non-SPLA licenses, it's completely different. First of all, non-SPLA licenses, unless they're brought to dedicated hardware, non-SPLA licenses, bring your own license, are licensed per virtual machine, per your end client virtual machine. And the licensing model is that per virtual core plus client access licenses. So in this case, client access licenses are required. And for Windows Server Essentials, if you host it, just note the difference that in SPLA it's licensed per processor, and in non-SPLA instances it's licensed per instance, but you probably won't encounter it. So just remember that in SPLA it's licensed per processor. How do you calculate core licenses? So let's talk about the hardware level. Hardware level, and for SPLA, it's your default model. It's what you're going to do for SPLA. And for non-SPLA licenses, this is an exceptional circumstance on a service provider. We're talking about co-location with client licenses. Just remember that there's no minimum of 16 core licenses per server in SPLA. Remember, these formulas are different. If you deal only with SPLA licenses, only count the minimum of 8. And by the way, I must mention it. If you, instead of procuring a proper tool to manage your SPLA licenses that is dedicated to SPLA, and there are only 2 tools right now that I know that work and are deployed around the world. It's Octopus Cloud and SPLA Manager from LicenseWatch. LicenseWatch? Yeah, I think so, yeah, SPLA Manager. If you use a traditional software asset management tool and you have legacy servers with less than 16 cores, those traditional tools will not calculate the requirements correctly. You will be paying more than you should. I would put it in general, don't avoid non-SPLA tools. They use wrong formulas. And here's an example. The first line is a legacy server, not very powerful, and you can see that you need fewer SPLA licenses than would be calculated by a traditional non-SPLA dedicated tool. So please be careful with that. At the virtual machine level, which is not available in SPLA, this is only for BYOL, the minimum of core licenses is 8 per virtual machine. And just to remind you, if an end client brings those licenses, they have to be on a subscription or with software assurance, and they also must have CALs on a subscription or software assurance, or, just so you know, a Microsoft 365 license that includes a Windows Server CAL. That's the third option. So, in regards to just calculating cores, the minimum per virtual machine is 8. Remember that you purchase core licenses. In SPLA, you only report 2 core packs, so don't forget to divide your calculated numbers by 2 before you submit your report to the licensing reseller. Non-SPLA licenses may be in 2 core packs, 8 core packs, 16 core packs, so please pay attention to that calculation. Please pay attention to that. They're breakable, by the way, can be broken between different servers, but most of the time you will be dealing with 2 core packs, and it's not really an issue. 2 core packs are just 2 core packs. Virtual machine and containers. So for Windows Server, there are 2 types of containers in Hyper-V. So there are other containers, but in Hyper-V specifically, you can have containers with Hyper-V isolation and without Hyper-V isolation. The shortcut that I have in my mind, not to confuse multiple types of containers, is that when a container has Hyper-V isolation, effectively it's a virtual machine. It's even technically just a virtual machine. It works slightly different, but what Microsoft said, because it's a virtual machine and consumes more resources, it's more isolated, we want to license each such container as a virtual machine. So when you count how many virtual machines you may run under Windows Server Standard licenses that are properly calculated per core, please remember that in SPLA the number is 1. And if it's, you manage a colocation server for a client, it's 2. But for SPLA, it's just 1. And notice here, if you want to increase the number of virtual machines, notice here how different the SPLA license totals are from non-SPLA license totals. So again, please make sure that if you manage SPLA licenses, you use SPLA calculation formulas. Skip through this. SAL dependencies. Yeah, I've shown you the SAL dependencies. Just a reminder for you that Office applications and Visual Studio, if they're used by clients in the remote desktop solution, don't forget to also report remote desktop service SALs. And if it's a case of bring your own license, unless it's a license included on the CSP hosted scenario, any other CAL, like remote desktop CAL, for example, requires a Windows Server CAL as well, and obviously access to an application in such scenario requires both remote desktop services CAL and Windows Server CAL. So dependencies, don't forget dependencies. It's not a frequent mistake. Fortunately, it's not a frequent mistake. It still happens. So how do you calculate? Sorry, I actually had this slide. How do you calculate the number of required remote desktop services SALs? So this is how auditors do this. And this is how you're supposed to track them yourself. They count all the users in all the nested groups included in remote desktop access groups and local admins groups. Normally, members of local admins, because they're admins, they are not included in the RDS SAL count, but some auditors, not all of them, some auditors, some auditor representatives even, that's usually even per person per team, may decide to include admins, local admins, in application SAL counts. Because if you check SPLA, there is an explicit exception for admins from RDS SALs, but not from Office SALs. It's strange. I can't explain it. And please remember, I will remind you again, one person, regardless of the number of accounts, regardless of the number of servers, requires one SAL, and only if it's a person. So service accounts don't require SALs. Another thing you need to know about SPLA disaster recovery host licensing is that Windows Server licenses for DR hosts are not required as long as you play by the rules of disaster recovery that are in details outlined in the service provider user rights document. Unfortunately, we see providers paying for disaster recovery hosts even when they are correctly used. There's no reason. Cost savings may be massive. As a recent example, I already mentioned it in one of the live events before, we estimated that if a provider does everything by the book, doesn't make any mistakes, and just uses DR as they designed it to be used, they would be saving a staggering $1.2 million per year on just not paying for disaster recovery service. But you must play by the rules outlined on this slide. Do not, under any circumstances, run any production workloads on disaster recovery service, on disaster recovery clusters, because if you do, then sorry, you have to license the entire cluster as production. So pure, clean, you can't be half pregnant. Pure, clean DR, free of charge. SQL Server deep dive, a little bit of deep dive to SQL Server. It has much more relaxed bring your own license rights. Downgrades are on this slide, and down additions. These days you will be mostly dealing with enterprise and standard. There's another edition which I don't know for what reason I didn't include on this slide. There's also SQL Server Web edition that is licensed per core, and it's a SPLA only product. So SQL Server Web edition is only available via SPLA. Licensing models for SQL Server, there are basically two. If we talk about SQL Server Enterprise, SQL Server Enterprise may only be licensed per core in SPLA and non-SPLA. SQL Server Standard gives you a choice. You may either license it with SQL Server Standard core licenses, or in SPLA, you may license it with subscriber access licenses. And in SPLA, instances don't require instance licenses or server licenses. So if you decide to go with licensing users of SQL, then you don't need to pay in SPLA for the SQL instances. As opposed to traditional bring your own licenses, where instance licenses are still required. So if an end client decides to deploy their SQL Server on a subscription or with software assurance in your estate through bring your own license program, make sure that they have both instance licenses with software assurance or on a subscription and SQL Server CALs on a subscription or with software assurance. But in SPLA, let's simplify this. In SPLA, again, it's either cores or SALs. So when we talk about SALs and CALs, please remember that if you choose that licensing model, access is always licensable. There are no exceptions. Externals, internals, doesn't matter. Everybody requires a SAL or a CAL. CALs or SALs are never bundled, never included with any other products. So they're always standalone licenses. There are no external connectors for SQL Server. And if basically the golden formula is if you have more than 20 users, go with core licenses. 20 users per instance. It's cheaper to go with core licenses. If you can't count users, go with core licenses. If it's externally facing application providing access, either go with SQL Web or, well, which is per core anyway, or switch to per core licensing. And the SAL model, because of that, has a fantastic advantage in SPLA. The number of instances is effectively unlimited. So the threshold where core licenses are cheaper is 20 users per instance with 4 cores. But the more instances of SQL Server Standard you deploy for that client, for whatever reason they need it, then that threshold moves up and up and up and up. And in large organizations, it often makes more sense to license SQL with SALs when there are lots of instances of SQL Server. But if there's a limited number of instances of SQL Server, then core licensing will be cheaper. So do the calculation. I mean, you don't need to learn it from me today. I gave you this number of 20 users per instance just as a starting point. Every time, do a calculation. How do you calculate core licenses? When licensing physical servers, in SPLA and non-SPLA, it doesn't matter. You count physical CPUs, then you count physical cores in each CPU, and then you assign at least 4 licenses, or the number of cores, to each physical CPU. And at the bottom of the slide, there's an Excel formula for that. And if you license virtual machines, or in this case, any containers, so thanks Microsoft for this confusion, but in this case, it doesn't matter what the container is. Isolated, non-isolated, so each container is treated as a separate OSC, operating system environment. So you need to count virtual CPUs or virtual cores. I would say, because some hypervisors really make it very confusing, count the minimal fraction of in processor fraction in the virtual machine. So say 8 threads. What's the biggest number? Unfortunately, this is how it works. So you can have 4 virtual cores having 8 virtual threads. So a thread is your metric, and you assign at least 4 licenses per each such virtual core, virtual thread. And the Excel formula is again on this slide. Remember that core licenses for SQL are sold in 2 core packs. So 1 core pack has 2 core licenses. Just remember when you do the calculation, don't make that mistake. Don't accidentally pay twice, because you won't recover that money from Microsoft. How to calculate SQL Server SALs? So much more complicated than RDS SALs, like way more complicated. SQL Server usage is 99.9% indirect. So you have, if you want to license per SAL, you need a robust way, a plausible way, how you calculate how many users actually require licenses. It's not interim users, not service accounts that provide access to hundreds of users indirectly, end users of the solution. SQL failover in SPLA. So in non-SPLA, now you have rights almost for 4 servers, different failover servers. In SPLA, it's very, very simple. It's the old rule. One instance for high availability is allowed for free in SPLA for each licensed SQL server. So you can have one active SQL server and one passive. The passive one is free. And that concludes this material. And I sort of managed to stay in the 60-minute range. If you have any questions, post this live, and I'll check the questions now, and I'll try to remember. As for the presentation, so Sydney, for you personally, yes, I can. For the rest of the participants today, send me DM, and there's no reason why I wouldn't share the presentation with you, but only via LinkedIn, please, or via email. So we have a question here. Have you come across any clients that have got their licensing through the Microsoft BizSpark program? I've only seen the single client that BizSpark was replaced. I have, but I forgot. I forgot how it worked. BizSpark had its own terms. As far as I remember, I may be wrong, but I am leaning towards they had bring our license rights, but I wouldn't be so sure. So you need to review, find the terms of that BizSpark 2018 and see what rights are included, what exceptions there are. It was not a standard licensing program. So unfortunately, I can't help now live. I mean, DM me. We'll see what we can do. And yeah, Sydney, as I said, it is possible to get the presentation. DM me on LinkedIn, and I can share this with you. Another thing for those who survived so far is, so by the way, QR codes, and I'll put our QR code here. What is it? It's just all the services we provide to service providers. If you think that you didn't get enough and I didn't deliver something, if you think that you would like me to go deeper on a product or a special tangent, or maybe explain all the cons and pros of the SPLA agreement requirements and allowances, if I have feedback asking for such a live stream, there's a certain probability that we'll do that, because what you saw today is 50 slides out of over 400 slides we have on SPLA. You may have noticed that it's a very condensed presentation. The full training takes almost 3 days. So we've never done it live on this channel, but we can do it in portions, depending on your feedback. So thanks for everybody who's been here with us today. Let me see if we have any more, questions. No. I hope to see you again, and I hope you learned something useful today in this session. My name is Alexander Kolev. I represent a company called SAMexpert. I'm surrounded by QR codes which you can scan, which explain what we do. Thank you, good luck, and goodbye.